Well, hello everybody again. I think you will notice that they gave me the graveyard slot after lunch. I don't know what that means, but at least you haven't been drinking alcohol. Well, I hope. That's for this evening. It's always more difficult with a room full of slightly intoxicated delegates, but you're not. So it's me again, and of course, as Sergio just said, when we look at trends in the world, there's much more to trends than simply technology, and that's what I would like to share with you this afternoon. So, every year in Barcelona, as some of you may know already, there's a very large trade show, an exhibition for the meetings industry called IBTM World. Some of you may have been there. The whole world is there. Cities, countries from all over the world exhibiting their venues, their services for the conference industry. The visitors to this exhibition are meeting planners, incentive travel organizers, people looking for venues, for destinations for their events. Now, every year, the organizers invite me to write a report on trends. We call it Trends Watch Report. Last year, it was sponsored by Sri Lanka Convention Bureau, so I guess I have to mention them again. It's an annual report. It's available online, free. So please don't hesitate to go to the IBTM World website and download the report. It has much more detail and depth than I can possibly give you this afternoon. But much of what I say in the next 20 minutes will be taken directly from the Trends Watch report, which I launched last November, updated for this particular occasion. Well, let's begin by looking at economics. You know, the volume of conferences matters a lot. It matters to me in the conference industry, but of course it also matters to you in the interpreting industry. It simply means more conferences, more business for us and for you, more business for destinations and venues, technology providers, and so on. So what do we see when we look at the economy? Well, the key word here is uncertainty. Very difficult. Last year, more than ever, it was very difficult to look ahead and to see how the world economy would be progressing. This matters to all of us in this room, because when businesses feel confident, they tend to have more conferences, more product launches, more mergers and acquisitions. That creates more meetings. When individuals are feeling more confident about the future, they feel more probable to invest in attending conferences like this one because they feel financially secure. We can see that it was a difficult year, unexpected polling results. There were two big surprises. One was called Brexit and the other one was called Trump. This was very disruptive. If we look around the world politically, what we see are rising protectionist and populist sentiments, especially in Europe, partly linked to the influx of immigrants. We've already spoken enough about the technologies this morning, and we see more geopolitical and social turmoil. A very interesting time to be working in any industry, but particularly ours, which touches all of these domains. The global economic performance last year can only be described as lackluster, very mediocre. The IMF, International Monetary Fund, their forecast for last year was 3.4%, slightly better for the year ahead. However, those are global figures, and of course when we look at individual regions, individual countries, we see sometimes a very different picture. For example, if we look at Asia in general and India in particular, we see fairly robust growth, rising prosperity, and we can contrast that with countries in sub-Saharan Africa who are in the last 12 months experiencing very significant downturns. Brazil and Russia, you don't need me to tell you that their economic challenges are intensifying. But it's the emerging market economies we should be looking at most closely. We used to call them BRIC economies, and then Brazil and Russia acted very differently to other BRIC countries. We think that 3/4 of the world's economic growth last year came from those emerging economies. So in a chart form, this is it here. You can see the advanced economies are making small steps, but it's the driving developing economies that are bringing about more global prosperity. We've looked at ICT and its impact on us. How about as an industry? There are 4 industries which are absolutely essential to the prosperity of the conference industry, and by association, your prosperity. Without these industries, I would say there would be practically no conference industry at all. Information and communications technology, what kind of year was it? Well, actually quite flat. We were not spending very much last year on software, hardware, not as much as we used to do. Corporate confidence had something to do with that, or should I say the lack of corporate confidence. Windows upgrade, ironically, made a lot of people decide to hang on to their older PCs since they had been upgraded to Windows 10. And mobile phone growth growing as it usually does, but look, emerging economies, Asia Pacific and China growing very fast. We simply last year were not buying enough of this stuff to give the ICT industry a good year. And this chart really explains it all. You can see that spending and growth are fairly modest in the global economy overall. Another key market, automotive. Some of our biggest, most lavish conferences are coming from the automotive industry. This matters. When they do well, we tend to do well, and you tend to do well. What kind of year was it for them? A good one. We were buying more of these products. The US market in particular, which has known problems in the past, had a very good year, although not expected to continue beyond this year. We can measure this through new car registrations, and you can see that they went up last year by 9.3%, which sounds a lot until you know that we're still way below the record year for 2007, pre-economic crisis. And here are the countries spending most of the money on new cars: Italy, Spain, Germany, then France, and then the UK. This is driving performance in the car industry. But ironically, for one industry, the emerging markets were not favorable, flat performance. However, we know that over the next 5 years in the pipeline, the Middle East and Africa, relatively unmotorized compared with Europe, North America, and so on, growth will come from them. So the automotive industry is betting a lot on success in those markets. The one to watch, Thailand, Indonesia, South Africa, Turkey, and Argentina. Large growth expected there in the automotive market. Pharmaceutical, I think this should almost be #1 industry for the conference business because they are simply so important, large consumers of our services. Optimism there in North America and Asia Pacific, strong demand for drugs, lots of development of new drugs in the pipeline. And remember, new drugs come along, doctors have to be trained in their properties, they are launched. This all creates conference business. Well, why is the pharmaceutical industry doing so well? It's because, unfortunately, that we're all getting a little bit sick. too many of us sitting down, chronic diseases related to those sedentary occupations like ours, but then probably more optimistically, simply the amount of investments by the pharmaceutical companies and more mergers and acquisitions. M&A, they always create a lot of conferences to be discussed, terms and conditions and so on. Some challenges ahead, unfortunately, for the pharmaceutical industry. Looking at the side effects of drugs much more, governments insisting that they do so. They need to develop a more environmentally friendly manufacturing process, but most importantly, increasing regulatory requirements. Governments insisting on safety, insisting on drugs being tested and retested before they are launched on the market. It simply means that that launch takes much longer than before while they're being tested. Construction industry, again, matters a lot to us. Not very good because of the general global instability. We were expecting a fairly poor year by the end of 2016. Bright spots, of course, it's never always the same around the world, the US in particular. But overall, the future looks better than last year with a large amount of investment globally expected if the political will is there. At the end of the day, it's a political decision. Do we build more schools, more roads and bridges and homes? We are completely independent of those discussions. But increasing urbanization is boosting the construction market, rising population, of course. People have to live somewhere. Asia Pacific, again, you've heard me mention it before already, large growth expected there. China, massive population growth, of course, now opening up its domestic infrastructure market to international investors. Good news for other countries' construction markets. So we're expecting, again, large-scale growth over the years to come. India, I've mentioned it a few times. That will be one of the largest markets for construction. And I just want you to look at this statistic, which has very little to do with construction. But by 2025, 1/4 of the world's workforce will be located in India. And of course, that nation, they tend to be well-educated, multilingual, highly skilled, and essentially lower cost. So watch out for those Indians taking your jobs. In the future, we're all vulnerable to that. Many of you, I know, not all of you, work in the association conference market. So leaving behind the corporate market and moving on to associations, what do we see here? Well, pretty good news. And this is fairly standard year after year, the actual growth in international associations. Many of you may be familiar with the UIA, the Union of International Associations based in Brussels. It's an association of associations. Well, every year they publish a yearbook about the number of international associations. In 1909, there were 213 such organizations. And if you look now, in 2017, we're looking at 37,500 international associations of one form or another, all with members, all holding annual conferences, at least once a year conferences. And if you look at the growth rate since 2008, you can see that it's a pretty steady pattern of growth almost every year. This is business. New associations create new demand for our services, and the numbers are growing fairly fast. Why? Well, reason number one, the world is changing fast. We're producing new professions, professions which 10 years ago did not even exist. Many of those new professions are linked to our concern about the environment. Many of them are linked to the demographics of the world, our aging population. So I just put a few examples up there of jobs which hardly existed 10 years ago: drone photography, online reputation management, gaming industry, a huge industry with its own international associations, and so on and so on. This is producing business for international conferences and therefore directly for interpreters. Another reason why we have more and more international associations is this one. The professions are atomizing, becoming much more specialized. People want to meet with other professionals who share the same specialization as them. Generic large-scale conferences in law, dentistry, for example, yes, well, of course they still exist, but the real growth is in the specialist professions: family lawyers, clinical negligence lawyers, pediatric dentistry, aesthetic dentistry. Those professionals have much more to say to each other than they do to a generic dentistry conference. Tourism, again, specializing, atomizing into different sections. Again, they all have their conferences. They may not be as large as those huge generic conferences, but they exist, they're international, and they need our services. And the final reason why we're seeing more association conferences is a more philosophical one: simply the rate of generation of new knowledge. It's growing so incredibly quickly that associations are finding that simply to keep their members informed, keep them educated, they need to meet more often, more frequently. An example here from the World Congress on Medical Law. Well, you can see in the early years of its existence, they met once every 3 years. That was enough. And then it became biennial, every 2 years. Now, they cannot help it, but they have to meet on an annual basis simply to keep up with the knowledge generated in their field or their profession. Good news for us: they need venues, they need technology, and they need interpreters. Where do the conferences go? This, to be honest, doesn't change very much year after year. These are figures from ICA, the International Convention and Congress Association, and you can see for the most recent year, I've marked the countries and the cities in red if they're in Europe. So I think a cursory glance at this table shows you the enduring popularity of Europe as a destination for international association conferences. We don't have a monopoly. Maybe 60 years ago, immediately after World War II, North America and Western Europe really were the only countries with the stability, the infrastructure for those big international association conferences. All of that is changing. And every year, other world regions, South America, Africa, Australasia, destinations there rise up this chart. We do not have the same share in Europe that we used to have in the past. So there are the statistics. 15 of the top 20 cities are in Europe. 13 of the top 20 countries are also in Europe as well. L'Association Internationale des Palais de Congrès, the AIPC, it's a bit like you, they have a French title. They are important. Their members are the managers and the owners of those large convention centers which we all have in our cities. When they report a good year, it means that association markets are growing strong. And you can see that last year, most of them reported strong or moderate economic growth compared with the previous year. It's an interesting association, and it's linked to what we do, of course. Looking at different world regions, especially the emerging ones, Asia-Pacific is one to watch, a good, well-balanced region for the conference industry. By that I mean a good balance between demand and supply. China, we cannot ignore it. Our industry is just exploding there, even in spite of its slowing economic growth. And interestingly, it's going beyond Beijing and Shanghai. A few years ago, the Chinese government declared that by 2020, China would be the world's #1 country for international association conferences as a destination. A very bold assertion, but it simply wouldn't surprise me. They are building convention centers like crazy, and many international associations are going there because A, they know that most of their members have probably never been to China, so it's attractive as a destination. We know a lot of people go to conferences simply to explore the destination. And B, they know that if they take the International Association of Architects conference to Beijing, they're going to pick up a lot of new members, Chinese architects, who will come to the conference. On the corporate side, however, the new focus on transparency in China means that they're looking much more closely at events. Is it a real conference or just a jolly way to spend the company's money? That is being controlled much more. But the association market over there, very strong. Of course, most of those conferences are intra-Asia Pacific, Asian Pacific countries meeting each other, but that's changing. They're becoming more adventurous, looking outside their region. You know, one of the questions for today is which languages for the future? Well, look at countries like Thailand, Malaysia. You know, they have vastly growing middle classes with the economic power and the curiosity and the desire to travel to international conferences. They need interpreters when they arrive. On the other hand, the infrastructure is growing in almost every region. There's no shortage of convention centers for our business. A couple of examples there, one from Sydney, one from Hainan in China, and a couple of pictures. The Hainan one is at the top, and the Sydney one is at the bottom. I love these places. Conference center architecture is one of my huge passions. I love the way those places are designed, and some work, of course, better than others. Latin America, well, no one needs to be told about the upheaval next door in Venezuela. Further in Brazil, that has had a very direct impact on demand for our industry. Nevertheless, Latin America, the brand is still popular. We had high hopes for Cuba last year when it became easier for Americans to travel there. Well, as you know, that has changed again, and it's still problematic for American companies to take their colleagues there for conferences and incentives. Hopefully that will change back. These are not rich countries, so costs are being controlled, but we have high hopes for Brazil when things calm down a bit, simply because after the Olympic Games and the World Cup, they have the infrastructure, the hotels, the airports, and so on for our industry. Bogota, some of you are from there, surprisingly perhaps, often mentioned as a rising destination for our industry. There's a lovely new convention center in Bogota, the Agora Convention Center. I would love to visit that one. So you have more hotels. The eyes of the world are on Colombia more than ever for conferences. Again, it was a place fairly problematic to bring an international conference to. That's all changed, and you have enormous novelty value, which makes you very powerful. In the Middle East, prosperity there, of course. The Middle East largely means Dubai. I was in Saudi Arabia a couple of times last year. That's a problematic destination because of the visa problems, the alcohol problems. But nevertheless, don't rule it out. But for the moment, Dubai is where most of the conference activity is focused. Great infrastructure, enormous number of flights in and out of there, making it very accessible. Again, every year I say this, new venues being opened up. Last year, these were the principal ones: the opera, parks and resorts, and the world of adventure. These are what we call unusual venues. Venues with a different purpose originally, but with a secondary purpose as a meeting destination. We're looking forward to the Oman Convention Center opening its doors. But of course, it's one thing to open a new convention center. Many destinations, in my opinion, completely forget that if you have a conference center which can hold 25,000 people, you probably need a lot of hotels to accommodate those people. Dubai doesn't forget that. Africa, I've mentioned, mixed picture there, but generally I would say demand fairly on the rise. Again, a vastly growing middle class with the interest in attending conferences, airlines expanding their networks, and again a few infrastructural developments. The Centre International de Conférence d'Alger has just opened, looks amazing, and Cape Town, the jewel in the crown of Africa, opening as well. And that's what they look like. The top one is in Algiers, the bottom one in Cape Town. What's the outlook for our industry in the future? Compared with last year, a bit more optimism around. Again, emerging economies will be the principal source of growing prosperity in our world this year and next year. But it would be stupid to pretend that there aren't any problems and any risks. Two tables here. Advito is an interesting report every year looking at, again, our industry. According to those surveyed for the Advito report, Brexit, #1 preoccupation. That's obviously a concern for Europe, and in particular my country. Concern within Europe, I think a little bit less now, that other countries might follow the UK's shining example. The Italian banking crisis, it seems a long way away from here, but it gave us a lot of nervous tension last year. And not going away, China's debt burden. That's more important than you think. If China's economy has a hard landing, we'll all know about it. Again, the GBTA, CWT, Brexit's there, but concern about the emerging market performance. Will it continue as before? Financial market turbulence always there, and so on. But when we ask PCOs, what are your major concerns, we get a very different picture. And remember, those are the people choosing interpreters. #1, they are concerned, and we should all be concerned, about reduced participant numbers. I've spoken about the expansion in numbers of associations and conferences, but if people are feeling financially insecure, they won't invest in a $2,000 trip to cross the Atlantic for a meeting of their international association, perhaps. #3, transportation costs, again having a direct impact. 4, funding, sponsorship for conferences, getting more and more difficult to find. And there, #7, budget restrictions, visa problems, and so on. So this is the thinking behind the PCOs, losing sleep at night. However, most surveys of the meetings industry suggest moderate positive growth for the year ahead, except for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And I suspect that it's Europe and Africa bringing that statistic down. Latin America, again, no great growth in group size, but shrinking costs is an encouragement to people attending events like that. Well, I went through that in quite a hurry. I hope in the Q&A session we'll have time to go over some of those points again, but I'm very aware that I have some excellent speakers following me, so now I'm going to pass on the word to them. Thank you for your attention very much.